Write the number. The rooftop dining room went silent. The heir to a billion-dollar criminal empire leaned back in his chair, swirling 12-year scotch in a crystal glass as if he were offering a harmless game. Write the number, Julian Romano repeated, tapping a gold pen against the white linen tablecloth. How much do you need to disappear? Every guest at the private club pretended not to stare. But they were all staring. The pregnant waitress stood motionless beside the table, black uniform pressed, hair neatly tied back, one hand resting lightly against the small curve beneath her apron. Her name tag read, Elena Hart. She didn't reach for the pen. Julian smirked. You walked into my club, he continued smoothly, loud enough for the table to hear but quiet enough to feel intimate. You interrupted a private dinner. You made accusations. That costs money. Eleanor's voice was steady. I didn't make accusations. Julian tilted his head. You implied. Across the table, Nico Valente said nothing. He hadn't intervened. Not yet. He watched. That was worse. Julian slid the pen toward her. Write the number, he said again. Enough to start over. Somewhere quiet. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably. One woman lowered her gaze. Elena looked at the pen, then at Julian, then at Nico. Her expression didn't change. I don't want money, she said. Julian's smile widened. They all say that. I'm not all of them. Soft laughter rippled around the table. Julian leaned forward slightly. Everyone wants something. He tapped the pen once more against the cloth. So what's your price? Elena inhaled slowly. Then she did something no one expected. She picked up the pen, but instead of writing on the tablecloth, she turned it around and placed it back in front of him. I don't want a number, she said. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you want? She met his gaze. A seat. The rooftop air changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but everyone felt it. Julian blinked once. A seat, he repeated, almost amused. At the table, she clarified. One of the guests let out a short laugh before quickly silencing herself. Julian leaned back again, studying her. You think this is a movie? No, Elena said. I think this is leverage. Julian's smile faded a fraction. Nico's gaze sharpened. Leverage, Julian echoed. Elena nodded once. You tried to buy my silence, she said. That means it's worth something. Julian's voice lowered. Careful. You made it public? She replied calmly. A pause. Julian's fingers tightened around his glass. You're pregnant, he said flatly. Not powerful. Elena didn't flinch. I didn't say I was powerful. Then what are you? Necessary. That word landed heavier than any accusation. Julian's jaw flexed. Nico still hadn't spoken. He was watching her the way a chess player watches someone move a piece he didn't expect. You think carrying a child gives you influence? Julian asked. No, she said. Then what does? Silence. Elena looked at the skyline beyond the glass walls for half a second, then back at him. What I know? Julian's smirk returned, thinner now. You don't know anything. I know enough. Nico finally spoke. Enough of what? The question was quiet, but it was the first time he had addressed her directly. Elena turned toward him. Enough to know you're losing 12%. The words did not explode. They settled. Julian didn't move, but the knuckles around his glass turned white. Nico's expression didn't change. Explain, he said. Julian laughed softly. She's guessing. Eleanor shook her head slightly. I'm not. Julian's tone sharpened. You're a waitress? Yes. Then act like one. She held his gaze. I was. Julian stood slowly from his chair. You're out of your depth? Am I? Security along the perimeter shifted subtly. Nico raised one finger. They stilled. Elena, he said calmly, if you're asking for a seat at my table, you should understand the stakes. I do. No. Julian cut in. She doesn't. Eleanor looked back at Nico. If I'm wrong, I walk away, she said. And if you're right? Nico asked. She didn't hesitate. I stay. Julian scoffed. You think that's how this works? No, she replied. I think that's how you avoid a bigger problem. Julian's eyes darkened. Are you threatening us? No. Then what are you doing? Elena's voice remained even. Offering you a solution. The silence that followed wasn't social anymore. It was strategic. Julian stepped closer to her. You came here alone? Yes. You interrupted a private dinner? Yes. You implied internal theft? Yes. And now you're asking for a seat? Yes. Julian leaned down slightly, lowering his voice. You're either brave, he said quietly, or stupid. Eleanor didn't look away. I'm prepared. Nico's eyes narrowed slightly. Prepared. Not desperate, not emotional. Prepared. What exactly do you believe you can contribute? Nico asked. Elena placed her hand lightly against her stomach. This, Julian muttered. But she shook her head. Not the child. She looked directly at Nico. Risk assessment. Julian laughed outright this time. Risk assessment? From someone who refills water? I've been listening, she said. To what? To the parts you assume no one hears. Julian's expression hardened. You don't belong here. Elena's voice stayed calm. Neither does 12%. That was the first time Julian's composure cracked visibly. Just for a second. But Nico saw it. And so did she. Nico leaned back in his chair slightly. If you're going to sit at this table, he said evenly, you'll need to do more than imply. I know. Then prove it. Elena exhaled slowly, and for the first time, she reached into the pocket of her apron. Julian's posture shifted instantly. Security tensed. She pulled out, not a weapon, not a phone, a folded document. She placed it carefully on the table. Julian stared at it. Nico didn't look away from her face. What is that? Julian asked sharply. Your next problem, she said quietly. Nico's voice remained calm. Open it. Julian hesitated, then unfolded the paper. His face changed. Not anger, not mockery. Recognition. Nico finally looked down at the page, and the air in the rooftop dining room shifted permanently. Julian Romano didn't read the document out loud. He didn't have to. The moment his eyes hit the page, the muscles along his jaw tightened as if he'd been punched somewhere no one could see. His grip on the paper changed, careful now, like it might cut him. Across the table, Nico Valente watched Julian's face, not the page. That was the difference between power and performance. Elena stood perfectly still. She didn't lean in. She didn't try to sell the moment. She let the paper do it for her. Julian forced a laugh, thin, controlled. Where did you get this? Elena didn't answer him. Nico spoke instead. What is it? Julian looked up, still holding the sheet, eyes calculating. It's garbage. Elena's voice was calm. It has your signature. That landed like a quiet slap. Julian's laughter stopped. One of the men at the table, an older banker type with a soft, expensive suit, shifted in his seat as if suddenly aware that breathing could be a mistake. Nico reached out 2 fingers. Julian hesitated, then slid the paper across the linen. Nico glanced down. His eyes moved once, twice. Nothing on his face, but the air got colder. It was a single-page authorization slip. Not a full ledger, not a dramatic dossier. Something smaller and more lethal. A routing approval tied to a shell entity most people would miss. Stamped, dated, initialed, and signed. Julian's signature wasn't the focus of the page. It was the footnote, which meant Elena had picked the right kind of proof. Not the kind that screamed, the kind that survived scrutiny. Nico set the page down gently. You work here, he said to Elena. How did this end up in your apron? Elena's eyes stayed on him. Because your people treat paper like it's invisible. Julian scoffed. We don't use paper. Elena didn't look at him. You do when you don't want an audit trail. Nico's gaze flicked to Julian for half a second. Julian's face tightened, but he kept his tone light. So what? You stole a sheet from some office? That's your big play? Elena shook her head slightly. I didn't steal it. Julian's smile sharpened. Then you're lying. Elena's voice didn't change. Someone put it where I could find it. The table went still. That was the first real pivot. Because now, the story wasn't just pregnant waitress makes accusations. Now it was, someone inside Nico Valente's operation had fed her a breadcrumb. Nico leaned back slightly, the chair barely whispering against the floor. You're saying there's a leak? Elena nodded once. I'm saying there's a war you haven't named yet. Julian laughed, louder this time, trying to reclaim the room. This is what she's doing. Drama, conspiracy. She wants a seat at the table? Fine. Give her a chair and let her tell ghost stories. Nico didn't react to Julian's volume. He looked at Elena again. Why you? He asked. Elena's stomach tightened. The nausea threatened to come back. Not because she was weak, because she was standing at the edge of the truth. Because I'm forgettable, she said. Julian's date, draped in diamonds and boredom, tilted her head. That's not exactly persuasive. Elena glanced at her once, then back to Nico. I walk past doors people don't notice. I clear plates people stop seeing. I hear the parts of conversations men assume don't exist. Julian's eyes narrowed. That line had teeth. Nico's voice stayed quiet. And what did you hear? Elena breathed in slowly. 12%. Julian's chair scraped a fraction as he shifted. There it is again. Elena continued, eyes on Nico. I heard it called a buffer. I heard it called insurance. And I heard someone say, it's safer if you don't know. Silence. Nico didn't blink. Who said that? Elena didn't answer. Not yet. Julian leaned forward. She doesn't have a name because she's making it up. Elena finally looked at Julian, and it was the first time she let him feel how sharp she was. You're not the only one who panics when corners close, she said. Julian's smile disappeared. Excuse me? Elena turned back to Nico. I'm not here to accuse him, not without structure. Julian's eyes flashed at the word. Structure. That was Nico's language. Elena continued. I'm here to tell you the truth. Someone is using your operation like a siphon, and they chose a time window. Nico's gaze hardened slightly. What time window? Elena's hand moved unconsciously toward her abdomen, then stopped halfway, like she caught herself. Tonight? She said. Julian scoffed. Oh, come on. Nico didn't look at him. Why tonight? Elena swallowed. Because you're all here. Because you're distracted. Because a public setting makes you hesitate to act. Julian's voice cut in sharply. You're calling me distracted? Eleanor didn't look at him. I'm calling you loud. That triggered something. Julian stood. Not slow now. Not controlled. His chair moved back with a sharp scrape that made half the table flinch. You think you can insult me in front of... Nico lifted one hand without looking at him. Julian stopped mid-sentence. The stop wasn't voluntary. It was conditioning. And everyone at the table saw it. Julian's nostrils flared. She's manipulating you. Nico's eyes stayed on Elena. What do you want? Elena didn't hesitate. Protection, she said. Julian laughed bitterly. There it is. Elena held Nico's gaze. Protection for two things. Nico's expression didn't change. Your child? Yes. And? Elena paused. The pause was deliberate. The leak. Julian's eyes narrowed. The leak? Elena nodded once. If you protect me, the leak keeps talking. If I disappear or die, the leak goes quiet. The room tightened. That was the second pivot. Because now, Elena wasn't asking for protection as a victim. She was presenting herself as bait. Controlled bait. The kind of bait that catches predators bigger than you. Nico leaned back slightly. You're asking to be used, he said quietly. Elena's voice stayed calm. I'm asking to be placed. Julian's laugh turned sharp. Placed where? You want to sit with us? You want to pretend you're one of us? Elena didn't look at him. She looked at Nico. I don't want to pretend, she said. I want terms. Nico's gaze stayed steady. Terms. Elena nodded once. A seat isn't symbolic. It's access. It's oversight. It's the authority to stop a transfer before it happens. Julian's voice rose. This is insane. Nico's response was quiet. Not necessarily. Julian froze. The date beside him went very still, her smile gone. Elena continued carefully. You have a problem you haven't identified. I can help you identify it, but I don't work for free. Julian snapped. You're a waitress? Elena met his eyes again. I'm an observer, she said. And you've been observed. Julian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Nico turned slightly to one of his men. Clear the mezzanine, he said calmly. The men moved immediately. The surrounding guests, bankers, lobbyists, silent investors, were escorted away without argument. Not rushed, just removed. Within 30 seconds, the rooftop dining room felt less like a club and more like a closed chamber. Only Nico's inner circle remained. Julian remained. Elena remained. Nico looked at Elena. You said someone put that paper where you'd find it, he said. You want me to believe a leak chose you? Yes? Why? Elena's throat tightened. Because the answer would expose her first real risk. She exhaled slowly. Because they know I'm pregnant, she said. Julian's eyes flicked to her abdomen. Nico's gaze sharpened. And they believe that makes you predictable, Elena continued. Desperate, easy to pressure. Julian sneered. Are you? Elena didn't blink. No, she said. It makes me careful. Nico's voice stayed calm. Who is the father? Julian's head snapped toward him. Does that matter? Nico didn't look away from Elena. It matters, he said. Elena held his gaze, then spoke carefully. The father is dead, she said. Julian's mouth tightened. Convenient. Eleanor ignored him. He died the week the 12% started moving faster, she added. Silence. Nico's eyes darkened a fraction. Julian stopped breathing for a beat, just a beat. Elena saw it, and Nico saw her see it. Nico's voice was soft. Name. Elena's pulse hammered. This was the cliff edge. If she said it, she couldn't take it back. If she didn't, she'd lose her leverage. Elena inhaled slowly. Daniel Mercer, she said. The air changed again. Not because the name was famous, because it was known. One of Nico's senior men, Luca, shifted his weight in a way that said he recognized the loss. Nico's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Julian's posture stiffened. Too stiff. Elena, Nico said quietly, if you're lying to me, there will be no seat. There will be no money. There will be no exit. Elena met his gaze. I'm not lying. Nico held her eyes for a long moment. Then he spoke the next sentence like a knife placed gently on the table. Then your seat, he said, is going to cost someone else theirs. Julian's eyes flashed. Don't, he said quietly, not to Nico, almost to himself. Nico didn't look at Julian yet. He looked at Elena. Tell me what you want, he said. Elena's voice remained steady. A formal role, she said. Temporary. Limited. Julian's face twisted. She's insane. Elena didn't stop. Access to transfer approvals, a veto window, and a guarantee that if anything happens to me, the proof goes public. Nico's gaze sharpened. You have more proof. Elena nodded. Julian's voice went cold. You're blackmailing us. Elena looked at him. No, she said. I'm negotiating survival. Nico finally turned to Julian. Sit, he said softly. Julian didn't move. Nico repeated it. Sit. Julian sat, and the power in the room settled exactly where it belonged. Julian Romano sat down slowly, not because he wanted to, because Nico had told him to. And in this room, that still meant something. The rooftop dining floor was now empty except for 5 men who didn't speak unless necessary. Nico at the head of the table, Julian on his right, and Elena still standing, no longer serving, no longer invisible, just present. Nico folded his hands loosely in front of him. Temporary role, he repeated. Veto window. Elena nodded once. You want oversight over transactions you barely understand. I understand enough, she replied. Julian let out a short, humorless laugh. You heard fragments through doors. I heard patterns, Elena corrected. Nico watched her closely. Explain the pattern. Elena inhaled slowly. The 12% isn't random, she said. It doesn't skim evenly. It moves during distraction cycles. Julian's fingers tapped once against the table. What does that even mean? Elena didn't look at him. It moves during events, she continued. High-profile dinners, negotiations, external expansion meetings. Nico's gaze sharpened slightly. You think someone uses public attention as cover? Yes. Julian leaned back, feigning calm. Or maybe you're just stitching coincidence into narrative. Elena turned toward him, finally allowing a thin edge into her voice. Then explain why tonight's transfer window opens at midnight. Silence. Julian didn't blink, but he didn't respond either. Nico's eyes shifted toward one of his senior men. Is there a window tonight? The man hesitated half a second. Yes. Julian's head snapped toward him. That's routine. Elena nodded slightly. Exactly. Julian's patience thinned. Routine transfers are not evidence of theft. Elena stepped closer to the table now, not aggressively, but deliberately. No, she agreed, but routine transfers that align with your expansion into Port Mercer are. That name changed the air. Port Mercer wasn't public knowledge. Julian's jaw tightened visibly. Nico's voice stayed calm. Who told you about Port Mercer? Eleanor's eyes held his. I heard you discuss it in the corridor 3 nights ago. Julian scoffed. Impossible. You were arguing, she said evenly, about timelines and about pressure. Julian's eyes flicked, just briefly, toward Nico. Nico noticed. You've been listening longer than tonight, Nico said quietly. Yes. How long? 6 months. Julian laughed. You expect us to believe you've been planning this for half a year? Elena didn't hesitate. Yes. That answer landed differently, because it wasn't defensive. It was confident. Nico leaned back slightly. You applied here 6 months ago? Yes. Julian's eyes narrowed. That's not coincidence. No, she said. Julian stared at her. You targeted this place. Yes. The honesty unsettled him more than denial would have. Nico studied her face. You knew Daniel. Yes. You knew he worked under me. Yes. You applied here because of him. Yes. Julian exhaled sharply. So this is grief dressed as strategy. Eleanor's voice remained steady. No. This is strategy shaped by grief. That line hung in the air like something sharpened. Nico didn't blink. You're admitting you infiltrated my club. I applied for a job. With intent? Yes. Julian leaned forward. You think that doesn't get you killed? Elena met his gaze. It could. Julian's eyes darkened. Then why do it? Elena looked back at Nico. Because Daniel told me something before he died. Silence. Julian's posture tightened. Nico's voice was controlled. What? Elena swallowed once. He said if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be external. Julian's hand clenched into a fist. Nico's eyes shifted slowly toward him. Julian felt it. This is absurd, Julian said. Daniel was loyal. He was, Eleanor replied. Julian leaned forward sharply. And you think I wasn't? Elena held his gaze. I think loyalty and ambition don't always align. The room froze. Julian stood halfway out of his chair again before catching himself. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said quietly. Eleanor didn't move. "I know." Nico's voice cut through the tension. "Enough." Julian sat fully this time. Nico turned back to Elena. "If you've been planning this for 6 months," he said evenly, "you came prepared." "Yes." "Prepared how?" Elena reached into her apron again. Julian stiffened instantly. Security tensed. She moved slowly, carefully. She placed a small encrypted phone on the table. Not flashy, black, unmarked. Nico's eyes narrowed slightly. "What is that?" "Insurance," she said. Julian's voice sharpened. "Of course," Elena continued calmly. "If I disappear, that phone activates." Julian scoffed. "You expect us to believe you built a dead man's switch?" Elena met his eyes. "I expect you to understand risk." Nico didn't look amused. He looked analytical. "Who receives the data?" he asked. Elena hesitated just enough to show weight. "Multiple outlets," she said, "and one federal contact." Julian's face changed. Not panic. Calculation. "You're bluffing," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "I'm pregnant," she replied. "Not reckless." Nico leaned back. "You came here knowing this could escalate." "Yes." "And you still walked in?" "Yes." Julian stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You're not asking for protection," he said slowly. Eleanor looked at him. "No," she said. "I'm asking for position." Silence. Nico studied her like a problem that had become unexpectedly valuable. "You understand what a seat means," he said. "Yes." "It means responsibility." "Yes." "It means consequences." "Yes." "And if you're wrong—" "I'm not." Julian's patience snapped. "You don't get to speak with that certainty in this room." Elena's voice didn't waver. "I just did." The quiet that followed wasn't fragile. It was heavy. Nico finally stood. Slowly. The movement shifted the entire energy of the room. Julian straightened. Security subtly adjusted positions. Nico walked around the table, not toward Elena at first, but toward the glass wall overlooking the skyline. He looked out over the city. Then he spoke without turning. "If there is a leak," he said, "and if someone inside my operation is siphoning 12%, he paused. "Then that person has already calculated my response." Elena nodded slightly. "Yes." Nico turned back toward her. "And they believe I won't move publicly." "Yes." Julian's voice cut in sharply. "Because moving publicly destabilizes everything." Nico didn't look at him. "That depends on how it's done." Eleanor's heart pounded. This was the pivot, the moment where either she became useful or expendable. Nico walked back toward the table. He stopped directly across from her. "You want a seat?" he said quietly. "Yes." "Temporary." "Yes." "Until the leak is identified." "Yes." "And then?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Then I leave." Julian laughed bitterly. "You think that's how this ends?" Eleanor met his gaze. "If I get what I came for, yes." Julian stared at her. "And what exactly did you come for?" She turned back to Nico. "Stability," she said. Julian scoffed. "You're naive." Eleanor's eyes hardened slightly. "No," she said. "I'm pregnant." The words weren't soft. They were strategic. Nico watched her carefully. "You're using that?" he said. "Yes." Honest, unapologetic. Julian's jaw tightened again. "She's manipulating you," he said. Nico's gaze finally shifted toward Julian. "And you're not?" he asked calmly. Julian went still. The silence between them was older than Elena, heavier, more dangerous. Nico turned back to Elena. "You get a provisional seat," he said evenly. Julian's head snapped toward him. "For 48 hours." The room tightened. Elena didn't smile, didn't react outwardly. "Within those 48 hours," Nico continued, You identify the leak. Julian's voice sharpened. This is reckless. Nico ignored him. If you fail, Nico said to Elena, you leave, permanently. Elena nodded once. And if I succeed? Nico's gaze hardened. Then someone else leaves. Julian's breathing shifted. Elena saw it. And in that small, invisible shift, she understood something important. He wasn't just threatened. He was afraid. Nico extended his hand across the table, not as a gesture of affection, as a contract. Elena looked at it, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, controlled, cold. 48 hours, he said. Elena met his eyes. That's all I need. 48 hours. That was the clock. Not symbolic, not dramatic. Operational. Nico released her hand first. Julian did not hide the fact that he was staring at her like she had just signed her own execution order. You're entertaining this, Julian said quietly, the calm in his voice now sharpened by disbelief. Nico didn't look at him. I'm containing it. Julian's eyes flicked toward Elena. You just gave her access. Limited, Nico corrected. Elena spoke for the first time since the agreement. I don't need full access. Julian's jaw flexed. Of course you don't. Elena ignored him. I need visibility on the midnight transfer window, she said, and approval routing authority on any transaction above 7 figures. Julian let out a dry laugh. You're negotiating like you've done this before? Elena met his gaze calmly. I've been studying it for 6 months. Nico turned toward one of his senior men. Prepare the internal dashboard. Restricted view. The man nodded and stepped away. Julian stood again. You're going to hand her internal routing controls? For 48 hours, Nico said evenly. Julian's eyes darkened. And when this destabilizes us? Nico finally looked directly at him. Then we correct. Julian held his stare for a moment too long. Then he sat again. But he didn't relax. Elena felt the shift immediately. She wasn't being tolerated anymore. She was being tested. Nico motioned toward the long side of the table. Sit, he said, not as an invitation, as instruction. Elena moved around the table slowly. Every step felt deliberate. Every eye in the room tracked her. When she reached the chair, she paused just half a second, then sat. Julian watched the movement like it offended him personally. A waitress, at the table, Nico's table. The internal dashboard tablet was brought forward and placed in front of her. Black glass, encrypted interface. Julian crossed his arms. Let's see what she does. Elena leaned slightly forward, studying the screen. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She observed. Midnight transfer window. Pre-cleared routing paths. 3 scheduled movements. 1 large, 2 mid-tier. Julian shifted in his seat. Routine, he said casually. Elena didn't respond immediately. She zoomed into the first transaction. Routing path. Entity A to shell C to offshore hold. Authorization chain. Digital. Approved. By Julian Romano. Her eyes moved to the timestamp. 7 minutes before this dinner started. She looked up. You pre-approved the largest movement before we sat down, she said calmly. Julian shrugged. Preparation. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Or insulation. Julian's smile was thin. You're reaching. Nico's gaze sharpened. Continue, he said. Elena tapped into the second transaction. Smaller, but routed through a different shell. The final beneficiary was masked behind a subsidiary she had only seen once before. She didn't say the name yet. She wanted to be certain. Her pulse was steady, but her hands were colder now. She zoomed out, then back in. She cross-referenced the timing. These 3 transfers overlap in clearance authority, she said. Julian scoffed. That's called efficiency. Elena shook her head. No, that's called stacking. Nico leaned slightly forward. Explain. If someone wanted to siphon without detection, she said, they wouldn't do it in one large, obvious move. Julian rolled his eyes. They'd fragment it, she continued. Distribute it across mid-tier movements that look like operational expansion. Nico's eyes flicked briefly to Julian. Julian didn't blink. You're describing standard scaling, Julian said evenly. Elena met his gaze. I'm describing laundering inside your own growth. The room went quiet again. Julian's tone hardened. Careful. Elena didn't back down. You asked me to prove it. Julian leaned forward. And if you're wrong? Elena turned back to the tablet. I'm not. She opened the masked subsidiary. It took longer to decrypt. Julian's breathing shifted. Just slightly. Elena noticed. The subsidiary loaded. Name appeared. Romano Holdings. Tier 2. Not external. Internal. Elena slowly looked up. You routed this through your secondary holding, she said calmly. Julian's voice was steady. Yes. Why? Tax strategy. Elena held his gaze. For internal expansion? Yes. Without board acknowledgement? Julian didn't answer immediately. That falls under my division, he said finally. Nico's expression didn't change. But the siphon isn't 12%, Elena said quietly. Julian's eyes flicked. Nico's gaze sharpened. It's 14.3. Silence. Julian froze, only for a breath. But it was enough. Elena leaned back slightly. You rounded down, she said. Julian's composure cracked visibly for the first time. That's speculation. Elena shook her head. It's arithmetic. Nico stood slowly. Julian remained seated, but tension radiated from him now. 14.3, Nico repeated. Julian exhaled sharply. You're letting a waitress audit us. Nico didn't look at him. I'm letting her finish. Elena tapped deeper into the routing logs. Then she saw it. A scheduled micro-transfer. Not tonight. Tomorrow. Just after noon. A liquidity shift that would consolidate the stacked amounts into a larger offshore channel. She felt her pulse spike. She didn't speak immediately. Julian noticed. What? He demanded. Elena looked up slowly. You're not siphoning tonight. Julian scoffed. Obviously. Elena's voice remained calm. You're consolidating tomorrow. The room stilled. Julian's jaw tightened. You don't have that authority, he said. Elena tilted the screen slightly toward Nico. Nico scanned it. His eyes hardened. Julian stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Elena's voice cut through the movement. You scheduled the consolidation for after the board luncheon. Julian stared at her. Public distraction, she said. Nico's voice was quiet now. Is that accurate? Julian didn't answer. The silence answered for him. Nico turned toward his senior man. Freeze the noon liquidity window. Julian's head snapped toward him. You can't just... I can, Nico said. The instruction was executed immediately. Julian watched the confirmation flash across the screen. Frozen. For the first time that night. Julian looked exposed. He turned slowly toward Elena. You think this makes you powerful? Elena met his gaze evenly. No. Then what? Relevant. Julian's voice dropped. You're in over your head. Elena's voice stayed steady. I don't think so. Nico stepped closer to Julian. You pre-approved stacking, he said calmly. Julian's tone sharpened. Strategic liquidity. Without disclosure. It was internal. Nico's eyes darkened. Internal doesn't mean invisible. Julian stared at him. You're choosing her. Nico's response was quiet. I'm choosing transparency. Julian let out a slow breath. You don't understand what freezing that window triggers. Elena watched him carefully. What does it trigger? She asked softly. Julian's eyes flicked toward her. Pressure. Nico's gaze sharpened. From who? Julian didn't answer. Elena felt it. The crack. The first real fracture in his control. You're not alone in this, she said quietly. Julian's expression hardened instantly. Be very careful. Elena leaned forward slightly. "You're not the leak," she said. Julian froze, not because she accused him, because she didn't. Nico's eyes shifted. "What are you saying?" he asked. Elena's voice remained calm. "You're the root." Silence. Julian stared at her. "You're being used," she continued. Julian's composure cracked visibly. "By who?" Nico asked. Elena's pulse pounded. This was the dangerous part. She exhaled slowly. "Someone higher than you," she said to Julian. Julian's face drained of color. And in that small shift, Nico understood something. This wasn't about ambition. It was about survival. Julian Romano didn't blink, but the color had drained from his face just enough to make the silence louder than anything he could say. "You're out of your mind," he said finally. Elena didn't look away. "If you were the architect," she continued calmly, "you wouldn't stack under your own name." Julian's jaw tightened. "You think I'm careless?" "No," she said. "I think you're ambitious." Nico watched both of them without speaking. Elena leaned slightly forward, her voice steady. "Ambitious men don't siphon 14% through traceable holdings. They delegate." Julian scoffed. "So now I'm a puppet?" Elena didn't hesitate. "I think you were handed a system that already existed." The room stilled again. Nico's gaze sharpened. "You're shifting the accusation," he said. "I'm correcting it," Elena replied. Julian laughed once, short and sharp. "You don't get to correct anything." Elena's eyes didn't leave him. "You weren't panicking because you were caught," she said. "You were panicking because the window froze." Julian's breathing changed. Subtle, but real. Nico saw it. "Why would that matter?" Nico asked quietly. Elena answered without looking away from Julian. "Because someone expects liquidity tomorrow." Julian slammed his palm lightly on the table. "This is speculation." Elena shook her head. "It's structure." She tapped the tablet again. "The noon consolidation isn't about growth, it's about repayment." Nico's eyes narrowed slightly. "Repayment to who?" he asked. Elena inhaled slowly. "That's the real question." Julian leaned back, forcing composure. "You're constructing a conspiracy to justify your seat." Elena's voice stayed calm. "If this was just internal ambition, you wouldn't have placed surveillance on me." Julian froze. Nico's gaze snapped toward him. "Surveillance?" Nico asked. Julian recovered quickly. "Standard security." Elena shook her head. "Not external surveillance," she said. "Targeted." Julian's eyes darkened. "You're imagining things." Elena held Nico's gaze. "The black sedan outside my apartment. 3 nights in a row." Julian didn't move. Nico didn't look at him yet. "Elena," Nico said evenly, "if you're escalating, you'd better be precise." "I am." She swallowed once. "The car disappeared the night Daniel died." Julian's hand twitched. Nico saw it. "And reappeared," she continued, "the day I started working double shifts." Julian's voice sharpened. "Coincidence?" Eleanor turned toward him. "You're very committed to that word." Julian's patience cracked. "You have no proof." Eleanor nodded slightly. "You're right." Silence. Then she added, "But someone does." That landed differently. Julian's eyes flicked, not to Nico, to Luca. It was almost invisible, but Elena saw it. And Nico saw her see it. Nico's voice dropped. "Luca!" Luca straightened instantly. "Yes, sir." "Were there additional security authorizations placed on Miss Hart?" Luca hesitated. Julian's eyes cut toward him sharply. "Answer," Nico said. Luca swallowed. "Yes." Julian stood abruptly. "That was my call." Nico turned slowly toward him. "Why?" Julian's voice was controlled again. "Risk containment. She mentioned Daniel before." "When?" Nico asked. Julian didn't answer immediately. Elena spoke softly. "The night before he died." Julian's head snapped toward her. "You weren't there." Elena held his gaze. "I was in the hallway." Julian's composure fractured. You were eavesdropping? I was listening. Nico's voice remained calm. What did you hear? Elena felt the weight of it. She was stepping into territory that couldn't be walked back. Daniel told him, she said quietly, nodding toward Julian, that the numbers didn't reconcile. Julian's face went cold. And? Nico asked. And Julian said it wasn't his level to question. Silence. Julian's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You're twisting context. Eleanor didn't blink. Am I? Nico stepped closer to Julian. Did that conversation happen? Julian's jaw clenched. Yes. And the numbers? They were under review. By who? Nico asked. Julian hesitated, and that hesitation was louder than denial. Elena spoke before he could recover. By someone you don't see. Julian's eyes flashed. You don't know what you're implying. Eleanor's voice was steady. I know that when the noon consolidation froze, you looked scared. Julian's voice rose. Because freezing liquidity triggers pressure. From who? Nico asked again. Julian didn't answer. Elena leaned forward slightly. You're not siphoning for yourself, she said quietly. You're buffering. The word hit. Buffering. Julian's composure finally cracked. You think you understand how expansion works? He snapped. Elena's voice didn't change. I think someone leveraged your ambition. Silence. Then Nico said something that shifted everything. Who is above you in this division? Julian stared at him. You know the answer. Nico's gaze hardened. Say it. Julian exhaled slowly. The advisory board. The room changed. The advisory board wasn't public. It wasn't even visible to most internal members. Elena's pulse pounded. She had suspected, but hearing it confirmed tightened everything. Nico's voice remained calm. Names. Julian hesitated again. Elena doesn't get that level, he said sharply. Nico didn't look at her. He looked at Julian. Names? Julian's shoulders lowered slightly. Caruso, he said quietly. Mendoza and Whitaker. Elena felt the floor tilt. Whitaker. She had seen that name once before. On Daniel's laptop. Nico's eyes narrowed. Whitaker manages external capital inflow. Yes, Julian said, and has no direct authority over internal routing. Julian didn't answer. Eleanor spoke softly. But he has leverage. Julian's eyes flicked toward her. You don't know what you're saying. Eleanor's voice remained steady. I know Daniel called Whitaker a pressure point. Nico's gaze sharpened. When? The week before he died. Silence. Julian's breathing changed again. You're connecting ghosts, he said. Elena shook her head. No, I'm connecting fear. Nico turned fully toward Julian now. You were buffering for Whitaker. Julian didn't answer. That's why freezing the noon consolidation scares you, Nico continued, because the pressure doesn't come from inside. Julian's eyes hardened. You don't understand the consequences. Nico's voice lowered. Then help me understand. Julian looked between them, between Nico and Elena. And something inside him shifted. Not anger, resignation. You freeze that consolidation, he said quietly. Whitaker calls. And? Nico asked. And he won't call politely. The room went silent. Elena felt the weight settle. She hadn't just exposed a siphon. She had uncovered a chain. And Julian wasn't the top. Nico walked slowly back to his chair. So, he said calmly, this isn't theft. Julian swallowed. It's leverage. Elena nodded slightly. External leverage, she said. Nico looked at her. And you believe Daniel discovered this? Yes. And that's why he died. Elena didn't hesitate. Yes. Julian's voice cracked slightly. You don't know that. Elena met his eyes. I know he was scared. Silence. Nico's expression hardened. If Whitaker is pressuring internal liquidity, he said slowly, then we're not dealing with ambition. He paused. We're dealing with dependency. Elena felt the truth of it settle. This wasn't a siphon, it was a hook, and the hook was set deep. Julian exhaled. You think you can just cut him off? Nico's voice was calm. I think I just did. Julian stared at him. He won't let that stand. Nico's gaze shifted toward Elena. You wanted a seat. Elena nodded once. Then welcome to the war. War. The word didn't feel dramatic. It felt overdue. The rooftop dining room no longer resembled a club. The music had been cut. The city skyline beyond the glass walls glittered indifferently, unaware that an empire had just shifted its footing. Nico Valente stood still for a long moment. Then he turned to Luca. Get me Whitaker, he said calmly. Julian's head snapped toward him. No. Nico didn't look at him. Now. Luca stepped away immediately, phone already in hand. Julian leaned forward, voice low and urgent. You don't call him directly. Nico finally turned. And why not? Julian's jaw tightened. Because he doesn't operate like that. Eleanor watched carefully. Not just the words, the fear. Julian wasn't afraid of being caught anymore. He was afraid of what came next. You've been managing this pressure quietly, Nico said, without informing me. Julian exhaled sharply. Because you would have overreacted. And freezing the consolidation is not an overreaction? Nico asked calmly. Julian's eyes flashed. You just forced his hand. Elena leaned slightly forward. Which means he has something to lose, she said. Julian turned toward her sharply. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Eleanor met his gaze evenly. I know he doesn't want visibility. Silence. Luca returned, his expression tight. He's not answering, Luca said. Julian's breathing changed. He won't, Julian said quietly. Nico's eyes hardened. Try again. Luca stepped aside to place another call. Elena's pulse thudded in her ears. This was the pivot. If Whitaker stayed silent, that was information. If he responded, that was escalation. Nico turned toward Elena. You predicted tonight's stacking, he said quietly. You predicted the noon consolidation. Yes? You predicted pressure. Yes, he studied her. What are you not predicting? Elena swallowed once. He won't wait, she said. Julian's eyes narrowed. For what? Nico asked. For you to push again. Silence. Luca's voice cut through it. He declined. Julian's face drained again. Nico didn't blink. Declined, he repeated. Yes, sir. Julian ran a hand through his hair, tension finely visible. That's not good, he muttered. Elena's mind raced. Declined meant one thing. He wasn't surprised. He was prepared. He expected the freeze, she said quietly. Julian looked at her sharply. No? Elena nodded. Yes. Nico's gaze sharpened. Explain. He's not reacting, she said. He's absorbing. Julian shook his head. You're reading into silence. Eleanor looked at him calmly. You're not panicking. Julian stared at her. And that scares you, she finished. Silence. Nico walked slowly toward the glass wall again. He knows, Elena continued, that if he reacts aggressively, he exposes himself. Julian's voice tightened. He doesn't expose himself. Elena's eyes flicked toward him. That's the problem. Nico turned. What leverage does he hold? He asked Julian. Julian didn't answer. Nico stepped closer. What leverage? Julian's composure fractured. He has capital tied into our expansion, he said. External investors that trust his channels. So he doesn't need to threaten you, Elena said softly. Julian's jaw clenched. He can starve you. The word hung heavy. Starve. Nico's eyes darkened slightly. Liquidity starvation, he murmured. Julian nodded reluctantly. If he pulls capital lines, projects stall, payroll tightens, expansion contracts, investors panic. Elena's stomach tightened. So the siphon wasn't greed, she said. Julian didn't respond. It was compliance, she finished. Silence. Nico absorbed that slowly. You buffered internal funds to maintain leverage against him, he said. Julian nodded once. And you thought you could outmaneuver him quietly? Yes. Nico's gaze sharpened. You didn't inform me? Julian's voice dropped. Because you would have escalated. Elena felt the tension shift. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about control, and Julian had made a choice without Nico. That's why Daniel questioned the numbers, Elena said quietly. Julian didn't look at her. He didn't understand the scale, Julian muttered. He understood the risk, she replied. Nico's voice was calm but colder now. And Daniel is dead. Julian looked up sharply. I did not. Nico raised a hand. I didn't say you did. Silence. Lucas stepped forward again. Sir? Nico turned. There's movement. Define movement. Whitaker's office initiated a liquidity shift 15 minutes ago. Julian went still. From where? Nico asked. External line B. Elena's pulse spiked. He's not calling, she said. He's acting. Julian exhaled sharply. He's applying pressure. Nico's eyes hardened. How much? 7%, Lucas said. Elena felt the pattern lock into place. 12 plus 7, she murmured. Nico looked at her. 19, Julian's face tightened. He's sending a message. Elena nodded slowly. He's showing he can move more than you. Nico's voice remained calm. Freeze external line B. Julian snapped. You can't freeze capital inflow. Nico didn't blink. Watch me. Luca moved immediately. Julian stared at Nico. You're escalating a silent war into an open one. Nico's voice was steady. It was never silent. Elena felt something shift inside her. She had expected resistance. She had expected hostility. She hadn't expected alignment this fast. But that made it more dangerous. Because now the war was visible, and visible wars demanded casualties. Julian leaned forward, voice low. You freeze that line, investors panic. Nico's eyes flicked toward him. Only if they know. Julian hesitated. They'll know. Elena spoke quietly. Not if the narrative changes. Both men looked at her. What narrative? Nico asked. Elena's mind moved fast. If Whitaker controls the capital narrative, she said, you counter with control of the stability narrative. Julian stared at her. Speak English. Elena met his gaze. Public reassurance. Julian scoffed. This isn't public. Elena shook her head. It will be if liquidity shifts continue. Nico's eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. Elena inhaled slowly. You don't freeze silently, she said. You announce strategic internal restructuring. Julian's expression shifted. That draws attention. Yes, she said, but controlled attention. Nico's gaze sharpened. You turn the freeze into a proactive audit. Elena nodded once. Yes. Julian stared at her. That implicates internal weakness. Elena's voice was steady. No, it signals strength. Silence. Nico walked slowly back toward the table. You're suggesting we move first? Yes. Julian shook his head. That exposes the advisory board. Elena looked at him calmly. Only if they're guilty. Julian's eyes flashed. You don't understand how deep this goes. Elena held his gaze. Then tell me. Julian hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. Nico spoke quietly. Whitaker isn't the top? Julian's silence confirmed it. Elena felt the weight of it settle. The advisory board wasn't advisory. It was structural. You've been playing middleman, she said softly. Julian didn't deny it. Nico's voice dropped. And you didn't tell me. Julian's composure cracked again. You were expanding too fast, he said. We needed capital stability. At what cost? Nico asked. Julian's eyes flicked toward Elena. At control. Silence. The war had just revealed its first real casualty. Trust. Nico looked at Elena. You wanted a seat. Elena nodded. You just stepped into a capital war with external leverage. I know. Julian let out a slow breath. She doesn't know what she's triggered. Elena met his gaze evenly. I know you're not the top. Julian's face hardened. And you're not safe. Elena's voice didn't waver. I never was. Luca stepped forward again. Sir? Nico turned. External line B has been frozen. Julian's breathing changed. Whitaker will respond, he said quietly. Nico's gaze was steady. I hope he does. Elena felt it. The escalation was no longer theoretical. It was active. Phones would ring. Capital would move. Pressure would build. And someone above Julian would have to show themselves. Nico looked at her one last time. You have 48 hours, he said. Elena nodded. Then we make them visible. They didn't wait long. The first call came 17 minutes after external line B froze. Not to Nico, not to Julian, to the secondary operations desk, which meant it wasn't panic. It was calculation. Luca stepped forward, phone in hand. It's Whitaker's office, he said quietly. Julian closed his eyes for half a second. He doesn't call twice, Julian muttered. Nico didn't hesitate. Put it through. Luca handed him the encrypted line. The rooftop dining room felt smaller now, not because of walls, because of gravity. Nico answered, yes. Silence on the other end. Then a voice. Measured, calm, almost pleasant. Mr. Valente, the voice said, unexpected restructuring tonight. Elena watched Nico's face carefully. He didn't react. Liquidity alignment, Nico replied evenly. A soft chuckle on the other end. Without consultation. Julian's jaw tightened. Elena saw it. The voice continued. You froze line B. Yes? And the noon consolidation. Yes. A pause. That was unwise? Nico's tone didn't shift. That depends. Silence stretched. Then the voice softened slightly. Your expansion into Port Mercer requires stability. It has it, Nico replied. Not without external support. Elena felt the tension coil tighter. Whitaker wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. He was positioning. Julian leaned slightly forward, like he could hear better through proximity. Nico's voice remained calm. Internal oversight is being adjusted. A faint pause. And who is advising you? Whitaker asked. Elena felt the question land like a probe. Nico didn't hesitate. I am. Silence. Then, that's unfortunate. The line went dead. Julian exhaled sharply. That was not good. Nico handed the phone back to Luca without comment. Elena's pulse was steady now. This was the moment she had anticipated. He didn't deny pressure, she said quietly. Julian shot her a look. He doesn't need to. Nico turned toward her. What did you hear? Elena replayed it quickly. He framed capital as support, she said. Not partnership. Julian scoffed. Semantics? No, she replied calmly. Dependency. Nico's eyes narrowed slightly. He wants control of the expansion, she continued. Julian's tone sharpened. He wants returns. Eleanor looked at him evenly. He wants compliance. Silence. Nico walked back toward the table. What happens next? He asked Julian. Julian hesitated. He tightens. How? External investors receive hesitation signals, Julian said, quietly. Elena nodded. He destabilizes confidence. Julian looked at her sharply. You don't know that. She met his gaze. You do. Julian didn't deny it. Nico spoke quietly. So we control the narrative. Julian exhaled. That won't stop capital pressure. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. But it changes who blinks first. Julian's eyes narrowed. You think this is a standoff? Eleanor shook her head. No. What then? A reveal. The word lingered. Nico studied her. Explain. Eleanor inhaled slowly. He's not expecting resistance from you, she said. He's expecting negotiation. Julian scoffed. That was negotiation. No, she replied. That was a warning. Silence. Nico's gaze sharpened. So what do you suggest? Elena's mind moved fast. If he relies on silence, she said, we make noise. Julian's patience thinned. You don't drag this into visibility. Eleanor met his gaze calmly. You already did. Julian's jaw tightened. You froze capital. Yes, she said, which means he moves. Nico watched her carefully. Go on. Eleanor swallowed once. You announce a strategic audit. Julian groaned softly. Again with this. Elena didn't break eye contact with Nico. You frame it as proactive governance, she said. Internal strength. Julian shook his head. That invites scrutiny. Yes, she said. Silence. Julian stared at her. You want scrutiny? Elena nodded. Yes. Julian laughed incredulously. You're insane. Elena's voice didn't waver. If he's confident you'll stay silent, he continues siphoning leverage quietly. Julian didn't respond. But if you invite scrutiny, she continued, he has to choose. Nico's eyes darkened slightly. Choose what? Elena met his gaze. Withdraw. Silence. Julian's breathing shifted. He won't withdraw, Julian said quietly. Elena looked at him. Then he exposes himself. The room stilled. Nico's voice was calm. And if exposure leads to instability? Elena didn't hesitate. Then you learn who truly stands with you. Julian stared at her. You think you can force his hand? Elena's voice was steady. I think he already showed it. Julian's head snapped toward her. When he declined the call, she said, he didn't want to negotiate. Nico nodded slightly. He wanted to observe. Yes, Elena said. Julian exhaled slowly. You're underestimating him. Elena's gaze didn't soften. No, she said. I'm underestimating you. That hit harder than anything before. Julian stood abruptly. You don't get to speak to me like that. Elena didn't flinch. I just did. Security shifted subtly. Nico raised a hand. Julian stopped. You've been managing his pressure quietly, Nico said to Julian. Yes. And you thought you could contain it? Yes. Nico's eyes hardened. You didn't tell me. Julian's composure cracked again. I was protecting expansion. From me? Nico asked quietly. Julian didn't answer. Elena felt the fracture widen. This wasn't just external leverage. It was internal mistrust. Nico looked at her again. You believe scrutiny forces alignment? Yes, Julian scoffed. It forces chaos. Eleanor turned toward him. You're afraid of chaos. Julian's voice dropped. Because chaos kills. Eleanor met his gaze. So does silence. The words hung there, heavy, true. Nico finally spoke. Prepare a statement. Julian's head snapped toward him. You can't be serious. Internal audit, Nico said calmly. Effective immediately. Julian stepped forward. You will trigger external panic. Nico's gaze was cold now. Only if they're guilty. Silence. Julian stared at him. You're choosing her strategy. Nico didn't blink. I'm choosing visibility. Julian's breathing grew heavier. He'll retaliate. Elena's voice was steady. He already is. Luca stepped forward again. Sir? Yes? There's movement in investor chat channels. Julian closed his eyes briefly. See? He muttered. Nico's expression didn't change. What kind of movement? Concern, Luca said. Rumors of internal restructuring. Elena nodded slowly. He's pushing. Julian looked at her sharply. You think you caused this? Elena met his gaze. No, she said. You did. Julian's patience snapped. I was stabilizing. Elena's voice was quiet. You were complying. Silence. The room felt different now. Less like a boardroom. More like a battlefield. Nico stepped toward Elena. You understand what happens if this escalates? Yes. You won't be protected by invisibility anymore. I know. Julian let out a dry laugh. She never was. Elena looked at him. I don't need invisibility. Julian's eyes narrowed. What do you need? Elena met his gaze calmly. Truth. Julian's composure faltered again. You think truth wins wars? Elena's voice was steady. No. Then what does? Position. Silence. And for the first time since she sat down, Julian realized something. She wasn't trying to survive. She was trying to rise. Nico looked between them. You have 48 hours, he reminded her. Elena nodded once. And you just made it louder. Yes. Julian stared at her. You better hope you're right. Elena's hand rested lightly against her abdomen. I don't hope, she said. I calculate. The announcement went out at 12:43 a.m. Short, controlled, surgical. Effective immediately, Valente Holdings initiates a strategic internal audit aligned with expansion safeguards. All liquidity pathways under review. Stability remains priority. No accusation, no panic, just strength. Elena read it on the internal screen as it propagated through encrypted investor channels. Julian stood a few feet away, arms crossed, jaw tight. You just declared war, he muttered. Nico didn't respond, because the response came faster than anyone expected. Within 5 minutes, 3 investor threads lit up. Concern, speculation, but not panic, not yet. Lucas stepped forward again, eyes scanning incoming data. Whitaker's office just requested clarification, he said. Julian's eyes flashed. He's moving. Nico's voice was calm. Let him. Eleanor watched the investor chatter patterns. Some were nervous, some were supportive. But one detail stood out. He's not withdrawing, she said quietly. Julian turned toward her. What? He's not pulling capital. Julian frowned. That takes time. Elena shook her head. No, it doesn't. Nico's gaze sharpened. What do you see? Elena zoomed into the external capital channels. Line C hasn't moved, she said. Line D hasn't moved. Julian's expression tightened. He's holding. Yes, Elena said softly. Why? Nico asked. Elena's pulse quickened. Because he's confident. Silence. Julian scoffed. Or he's calculating. Elena looked at him. He expected this. Julian didn't answer. Nico stepped closer to the screen. You're saying the freeze didn't destabilize him? Yes. Julian's voice sharpened. You wanted escalation. This is escalation. Elena shook her head slowly. No. What then? Julian snapped. Observation. The room stilled. Nico's voice dropped. He's letting us expose ourselves. Elena nodded once. Yes. Julian's breathing changed. That's not possible. Elena turned toward him. You told me he doesn't operate emotionally. Julian didn't respond. You told me he thinks long-term, she continued. Julian's jaw tightened. Yes. Elena leaned slightly forward. Then why would he panic? Silence. The answer was obvious. He wouldn't. He would wait. Lucas stepped forward again. Sir? Yes. There's another movement. Julian stiffened. From where? Nico asked. Internal, Lucas said. Elena's pulse spiked. Show me. The screen shifted. An internal micro-transfer. Not large, but precise. It originated from a secondary operational budget and routed through a holding she hadn't noticed before. Elena leaned in closer. That wasn't frozen, she murmured. Julian's face went pale. That's not authorized. Nico's gaze snapped toward him. You didn't approve it? No. Elena's mind moved fast. If he can't move externally, she said, he tests internally. Julian shook his head. That's impossible. Those channels are locked. Luca's voice was tight. Apparently not. Nico stepped closer to the table. Who has clearance? Julian hesitated. Elena saw it. Julian, Nico said quietly. Julian exhaled sharply. 3 advisory signatures. Elena's heart pounded. Whitaker, she said. Julian nodded. And? Nico pressed. Julian's jaw tightened. Mendoza. Elena felt the room tilt. And Caruso. Silence. Nico's voice lowered. So freezing liquidity didn't corner him. Elena shook her head. No. It isolated you, Nico finished. Julian went still. Elena turned toward him. He wanted you visible, she said softly. Julian stared at her. You made me visible. Elena's voice didn't waver. No, she said. You already were. The internal microtransfer finalized. Confirmation flashed across the screen. Small, precise, calculated. Nico's gaze hardened. He's testing our perimeter. Julian ran a hand through his hair. He's probing. Elena nodded. He wants to see how fast you respond. Nico turned toward Luca. Lock internal secondary channels. Julian stepped forward. That signals panic. Nico's eyes didn't move. It signals control. Julian exhaled sharply. You're playing into his hands. Elena shook her head. No, she said quietly. We're revealing them. Julian stared at her. You think you understand him? Eleanor's voice was steady. I understand patterns. Julian's eyes darkened. You don't understand cost. Eleanor met his gaze. I do. Julian's voice dropped. If this collapses expansion, jobs vanish. Elena didn't blink. If this continues, control vanishes. Silence. Nico stepped between them slightly. Enough. The tension shifted again. Luca returned with updated feeds. Investor sentiment holding, he said, but advisory channels are active. Julian closed his eyes briefly. He's calling them. Elena's pulse ticked faster. That's what we wanted. Julian looked at her sharply. You wanted him visible? Yes. Nico's voice was quiet. And now? Elena inhaled slowly. Now we bait. Julian let out a humorless laugh. You think this is fishing? Elena's gaze sharpened. No, it's leverage. Nico studied her. What's the bait? Elena's fingers hovered over the tablet. She hesitated. This was the dangerous part. If we publicly name advisory restructuring, she said carefully, he has to respond. Julian's eyes widened slightly. You want to name the board? Elena nodded. Yes. Julian's composure cracked. That implicates internal hierarchy. Yes. It fractures alliances. Yes. Nico watched her closely. You're accelerating. Yes. Julian shook his head. You're forcing him into a corner. Elena met his gaze. That's the point. Silence. Nico's eyes darkened. And when cornered? Elena didn't hesitate. He shows his real leverage. Julian's breathing grew heavier. You don't know how dangerous that is. Elena's voice was steady. I do. Julian stared at her. You're pregnant. Elena held his gaze. Yes. And you're inviting retaliation. Elena's hand rested lightly against her abdomen. I've already survived it. The room went quiet. Nico's voice was calm. Prepare the second announcement. Julian turned sharply. You can't. Nico didn't look at him. Advisory review effective immediately. Julian's jaw tightened. This crosses lines. Eleanor looked at him softly. He already crossed them. The message went out. Short, controlled, deadly. Advisory restructuring under evaluation. Internal oversight expanded to ensure operational integrity. Within seconds, the response came. Not from investor channels, from a private encrypted line. Luca froze. Sir? Nico turned. It's Mendoza. Julian went pale. Put him through, Nico said. The line connected. A voice harder than Whitaker's, less polished. Interesting move, Mendoza said. Nico didn't flinch. Necessary. A short pause. You've been advised not to escalate. Julian swallowed. Nico's voice was steady. I don't take advice blindly. Mendoza's tone hardened. You've just destabilized capital confidence. Elena felt the pressure spike. Good. That meant they were exposed. Nico replied evenly. Capital confidence remains. Mendoza's next words landed like a blade. For now. The line went dead. Silence. Julian stared at the table. You see? He whispered. Elena's pulse steadied. They're responding, she said. Nico looked at her. Yes. Julian looked up slowly. And now they escalate. Elena met his gaze. Good. Julian stared at her like she was insane. You wanted visibility, she said quietly. We have it. Nico's eyes darkened. 48 hours, he reminded her. Elena nodded once. And now, she said, we see who bleeds first. The retaliation didn't come as a threat. It came as absence. At 2:17 a.m., 3 external investor threads went silent. Not argumentative, not reactive, silent. Luca stared at the dashboard. They're pulling back, he said quietly. Julian's voice was tight. From where? Not capital, Luca replied. Confidence. Elena watched the metrics shift, engagement dropping, inquiry spikes flattening. The advisory network wasn't attacking publicly. They were suffocating quietly. He's not bleeding, Julian muttered. Elena's eyes stayed on the data. No, she said softly. He's isolating. Nico stepped closer. Explain. Elena inhaled slowly. He's separating you from external validation, she said. If investors hesitate, pressure grows internally. Julian's jaw tightened. He's testing board loyalty. Elena nodded. Yes. Nico's gaze hardened. Then we accelerate. Julian snapped his head toward him. You accelerate now, and you fracture alliances. Nico didn't blink. They're already fractured. Julian ran a hand over his face. You don't understand how deep Whitaker's capital web runs. Elena turned toward him. Then show us. Julian hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Nico's voice dropped. You still haven't told me everything. Julian looked between them, between power and exposure. He controls 3 silent funds, Julian said finally. Not public, not documented in our primary sheets. Elena's pulse spiked. Why? She asked quietly. Julian's eyes darkened. Because expansion needed liquidity fast. Nico's voice was cold now. You tied us to unrecorded capital. Julian exhaled sharply. I tied us to growth. Elena shook her head. You tied him to us. Silence. Julian didn't deny it. Luca stepped forward again. Sir? Nico turned. Investor line D just shifted. Julian stiffened. How much? 5%. Elena felt the pattern close in. 12. 7. 5. Nico's gaze sharpened. 24. Julian whispered, he's consolidating leverage. Elena nodded. He's creating dependency ratios. Julian stared at her. You're seeing patterns too fast. Elena met his gaze. I've had 6 months. Silence. Nico looked at the screen. If he holds 24% influence across advisory-linked capital. Julian finished the sentence quietly. He doesn't need majority. Elena's stomach tightened, because that meant something else. He needs narrative control, she said. Julian looked at her sharply. Yes. Nico's eyes darkened. He's going to frame this as instability. Elena nodded slowly. Yes. Julian's breathing grew heavier. He'll leak. Silence. Nico turned. To who? Julian hesitated. Financial press. Elena felt the cold settle in her spine. If he leaks restructuring as panic, she said. Investors retreat. Julian nodded. And then we actually bleed. Nico's voice remained steady. So we leak first. Julian stared at him. You're serious? Nico didn't blink. Yes. Elena's heart pounded. This was the real pivot, not freeze, not audit, narrative war. Julian shook his head slowly. You don't understand media leverage. Elena met his gaze. You underestimate it. Julian's voice sharpened. You're not equipped for this. Elena's expression didn't change. Neither were you. Silence. Nico turned toward her. You're suggesting controlled disclosure? Yes. About what? Elena inhaled slowly. About advisory overreach. Julian's face drained. That implicates Whitaker directly. Elena nodded. Yes. Julian's composure cracked. He'll retaliate hard. Elena's voice was steady. He already is. Lucas stepped forward again. Sir, incoming. Nico turned. Source? Private investor syndicate. Julian closed his eyes briefly. It's happening. The message displayed. Concern over liquidity transparency. Request for direct assurance. Nico read it once, then handed the tablet to Elena. Answer it. Julian's head snapped toward him. You can't let her speak for us. Nico didn't look at him. I am. Elena felt the weight land. This wasn't analysis anymore. This was authority. She read the message carefully, then typed. Measured. Precise. Valente Holdings initiated internal review proactively. Capital remains secured. Advisory restructuring ensures long-term integrity. No liquidity risk. She stopped, looked at Nico. He nodded. She sent it. Julian stared at her. You sound confident. Elena looked at him calmly. I am. Julian let out a dry laugh. You're either brilliant, he paused, or suicidal. Elena didn't respond, because at that exact moment, Luca's phone buzzed again. His face went pale. Sir. Nico turned. Whitaker just scheduled a board call. Julian went still. When? Nico asked. 30 minutes. Silence. Elena's pulse steadied. He's not hiding anymore, she said quietly. Julian looked at her. He's gathering allies. Elena nodded. Yes. Nico's voice was calm. Then we attend. Julian stared at him. You don't walk into that unprepared. Elena met his gaze. We don't walk in blind. Julian's eyes narrowed. You think you're ready? Eleanor's hand rested lightly against her stomach. No, she said, but I'm positioned. Julian's breathing slowed. You have no idea how ugly this gets. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. I didn't come here for pretty. Silence. Nico stepped closer. You understand something, he said quietly. Elena looked at him. Yes. If Whitaker calls the board, he believes he has majority. Eleanor nodded. Yes. And if he believes that, Elena finished it. He thinks Julian is replaceable. Julian froze. The realization hit harder than accusation. Silence. Nico's gaze shifted slowly to Julian. Julian swallowed. He wouldn't. Elena met his eyes. He already has. Julian's composure fractured. You don't know that. Elena's voice was steady. Why call the board now? Julian didn't answer, because he knew. Nico's voice lowered. He's going to offer them stability. Julian exhaled sharply. At my expense. Silence. The war had just revealed its real objective. Not capital, control. And Julian was the expendable piece. Elena leaned back slightly. You're not the architect, she said softly. You're the leverage. Julian stared at her. For the first time. Not with anger, with understanding. The board call connected at 2:58 a.m. No introductions, no pleasantries. Just screens lighting up across the encrypted wall display in Nico's private chamber. 3 faces appeared first. Caruso, Mendoza. And finally, Whitaker. Calm, composed, unshaken. Julian stood slightly behind Nico now. Not at the head, behind, and he felt it. Whitaker spoke first. Mr. Valente, unexpected turbulence tonight. Nico didn't flinch. Strategic correction. Whitaker's lips curved faintly. Freezing liquidity lines is not correction, it's panic. Eleanor stood to the side of the table, not speaking, observing. Whitaker's eyes flicked briefly toward her. Just once. And that was enough. He knew. Who is she? Whitaker asked casually. Nico didn't hesitate. Internal oversight. Whitaker's gaze sharpened. Temporary, I assume. For now, Nico replied. Caruso leaned forward on screen. You've destabilized investor confidence. Elena's voice entered smoothly. Confidence metrics remained stable. All eyes turned to her. Julian stiffened. Whitaker studied her carefully. "You must be the catalyst," he said. Elena met his gaze evenly. "I prefer correction." Whitaker smiled faintly. "You froze internal consolidation." "Yes," she said. "You restricted advisory-linked channels." "Yes?" Whitaker's voice cooled slightly. "That was not authorized." Nico responded evenly. "It was." Whitaker leaned back. "You misunderstand structural hierarchy." Silence. Elena stepped forward half a step. "Do we?" she asked quietly. Whitaker's eyes flicked toward her again. There it was. The smallest shift. Interest. Not dismissal. Interest. Julian felt it too. Whitaker continued, calm and measured. "Advisory influence exists to stabilize volatility." Elena nodded. "Influence," she repeated softly. Whitaker's expression didn't change. "Yes." Elena's voice remained steady. "Influence doesn't require silent funds." The screens went still. Mendoza's jaw tightened slightly. Caruso looked away. Whitaker's smile faded a fraction. "You're making assumptions?" Elena tilted her head slightly. "Are we?" Whitaker's tone cooled. "You froze liquidity without understanding downstream obligations." Elena didn't blink. "Obligations to who?" Whitaker didn't answer directly. "That information exceeds your clearance." Julian's breathing changed, because that was the first open acknowledgement of hierarchy. Nico's voice dropped. "There is no hierarchy above me." Whitaker's eyes held steady. "There is capital." Silence. And that was the truth. Not guns. Not loyalty. Capital. Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "You expanded aggressively. Advisory capital ensured stability." Elena's voice was quiet. "At the cost of internal sovereignty." Whitaker's gaze sharpened. "You're naive." Elena's expression didn't change. "No," she said. "I'm observant." Whitaker's tone cooled further. "You think exposure strengthens you?" Elena held his gaze. "I think dependency weakens you." A pause. Small, but real. Whitaker recalculated. "You're pregnant," he said suddenly. The room froze. Julian stiffened. Nico's expression hardened. Elena's hand rested lightly against her abdomen. "Yes." Whitaker's eyes studied her. "You're emotional." Elena didn't flinch. "I'm strategic." Whitaker's voice sharpened slightly. "You walked into a capital war thinking visibility protects you." Elena met his gaze calmly. "I walked in knowing silence would kill me." Silence. Whitaker's composure remained, but his eyes shifted, just slightly, toward Julian. And that was the reveal. Elena saw it instantly. Whitaker wasn't worried about Nico. He was measuring Julian. Because Julian was the lever. Whitaker spoke again. "You destabilized advisory confidence." Elena's voice remained steady. "No," she said. "We isolated leverage." Mendoza cut in. "You are overstepping." Elena turned slightly toward the camera. "Then step back." Caruso's face tightened. Whitaker's smile returned faintly. "You believe you can force withdrawal?" Elena nodded. "Yes?" Whitaker leaned back slowly. "And if I don't?" Silence. Elena didn't hesitate. "Then you expose yourself." Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Expose how?" Eleanor's voice was quiet. "Through your silent funds." The screens went very still. Julian stopped breathing. Whitaker's expression didn't crack, but it cooled. "You have no proof," he said calmly. Elena held his gaze. "You just confirmed their existence." Silence. Caruso shifted. Mendoza looked uncomfortable. Julian stared at Whitaker. And for the first time, he saw it. He was expendable. Whitaker's tone hardened slightly. "You misunderstand leverage?" Elena's voice didn't waver. "No," she said. "You misunderstand visibility." Whitaker stared at her. "You think this is about you?" Elena shook her head. "No." She looked at Julian. "It's about him." Julian's breath caught. Whitaker's eyes flicked again. Small, but telling. Elena continued. You positioned him as buffer, she said calmly. Compliance shield. Whitaker's smile vanished. He managed expansion. Elena nodded. Yes. And now, she said quietly, you'll replace him. Silence exploded across the screens. Julian stared at Whitaker. Whitaker didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He simply remained still, and that stillness said everything. Nico's voice cut through. Is that accurate? Whitaker's gaze shifted to Nico. Leadership evolves. Julian's composure shattered. You were going to cut me, he said quietly. Whitaker's tone remained smooth. You became visible. Silence. Elena watched Julian's expression shift. Anger, realization, betrayal. Whitaker continued calmly. The board values stability. Julian's voice cracked slightly. You used me. Whitaker didn't answer, because he didn't need to. Nico's gaze hardened. You leveraged internal loyalty to secure external control. Whitaker's eyes met his. Capital demands structure. Eleanor stepped forward fully now. And you lost it tonight. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. How? Eleanor's voice was steady. You showed your hand. Silence. Caruso looked away. Mendoza shifted uncomfortably. Julian stared at the screen. Whitaker leaned back. You have no majority. Elena nodded. No. She looked at Julian. But you don't either. Whitaker's composure finally thinned. Slightly. You assume he sides with you. Elena met Julian's eyes. You already cut him. Julian looked at Whitaker, and the last thread snapped. You were consolidating, Julian said quietly. Whitaker didn't deny it. Nico spoke slowly. Advisory leverage ends tonight. Whitaker's voice sharpened. You don't have the votes. Elena's voice cut through. You don't have invisibility. Silence. Caruso cleared his throat slightly. Mendoza looked conflicted. Whitaker saw it, and for the first time, he recalculated. You're emotional, he said to Elena again. Elena's voice remained steady. No. She looked at Nico. I'm positioned. Nico stepped forward. Advisory silent funds will be audited, he said calmly. Publicly. Whitaker's eyes hardened. That would damage everyone. Elena shook her head slightly. No, she said. It damages control. Julian finally spoke clearly. I withdraw advisory alignment. The room froze. Whitaker's eyes flashed. Be careful, he said softly. Julian held his gaze. You were going to replace me. Whitaker didn't respond, because that was answer enough. Caruso shifted. Mendoza hesitated. The board wasn't unified anymore. Whitaker saw it, and he understood. Visibility had cost him leverage. He could fight, but it would expose the silent funds, and that would fracture capital confidence permanently. Whitaker leaned back slowly. This isn't over, he said. Nico's voice was calm. No. Whitaker's gaze settled on Elena one last time. You forced timing. Elena met his eyes. Yes. The call disconnected. The screens went dark. Silence filled the room. Julian stood motionless. You knew, he said quietly to Elena. She looked at him. I calculated. Julian exhaled slowly. You used me. Elena's voice was steady. No, she said. He did. Nico looked at her. You didn't come here for protection. Elena shook her head. No. You came to reposition power. Yes. Silence. Nico studied her for a long moment. You asked for a seat. Elena nodded. Yes. He walked slowly to the head of the table, then looked back at her. You earned one. Julian didn't argue, because he understood now. She hadn't asked for money. She hadn't asked for mercy. She had asked for position, and she had taken it. Elena felt the weight settle. Not relief, not victory. Control. Her hand rested gently over her stomach, not as a shield, as a reminder. Power shifts quietly. And tonight, It shifted toward her.